when I was about 12, 13 years old, I went with my bowling league to bowl in the state tournament down in Los Angeles. And it was a really great trip because it was a week long, but we only bowled on the weekend. And so every day we went to a different amusement park. And so we went to like Magic Mountain and Knott's Berry Farm. And then on the very last day, we went to Disneyland. And I had done a pretty good job of rationing my money. I still had $30 left, which, you know, back in the 70s was, you know, a good amount of money to buy food for the day at Disneyland. So I was ready to go. And so the first thing that my friends wanted to do when we went into the front gate is they went straight for the big souvenir shop by the front gate at Disneyland. And they all had a lot more money than me, so they're buying all these really cool souvenirs. And I thought, man, I want some souvenirs because all this stuff looks really great. So I bought something for my mom and my brother and for myself. And I spent all my money on souvenirs, which honestly, it was really dumb. Not just because I didn't have any money left for food, but because now I had these stupid souvenirs I had to carry around all day, and we were going to be there until after midnight. And I realized that they put the souvenir shop where they did, not so you could buy it going in, but so you could buy it coming out, which would have been the really smart thing to do. Now, we got there right when the gates opened, first thing in the morning, and I was really hungry because I had not had breakfast yet. So all my friends, they go to breakfast, and I'm there, and I don't have any money, so I don't buy any breakfast, and they say, well, Gary, aren't you going to have any breakfast? And I'm trying to play it off, well, no, you know, I'm not hungry. I don't need anything to eat. Well, you know, the reality was I was really hungry. So I started drinking a lot of water to try and get, you know, something in my stomach so that I would feel more full. And of course, all day, they're just buying stuff. You know, they're buying funnel cakes and ice cream and dots and just dumb stuff. And I'm just sitting there salivating the whole time. So lunch finally rolls around. And of course, they all go to some really great place. And I can't like just ditch them for lunch. So I go in and I'm not eating anything again. And they ask, well, aren't you hungry? And why aren't you eating anything? And I said, well, no, I'm not hungry. Everything's fine. It's all good. I don't need anything. And they're like, okay, suit yourself. Well, you know, all through the afternoon, I'm just getting hungrier and hungrier. And I'm too embarrassed to tell them that I spent all my money, and I'm too proud to ask for help. And so dinner rolls around, and of course, they're eating cheeseburgers and French fries and milkshakes and, you know, again, getting dessert and funnel cakes and all that kind of stuff. And they're all just chowing down. And again, you know, Gary, why aren't you eating anything? Oh, I'm not hungry. They're like, we know this line. You haven't eaten anything all day. And they kind of, some of them started putting two and two together, that I had probably spent all my money or whatever. And so one of the guys went to one of the bowling coaches, and they found him, and then he tracked me down about 9 o'clock at night. Now, by this time, I thought I was going to die. I was so hungry. It's the hungriest I've ever been in my life, which actually speaks to how fortunate I've been in my life, if that's the hungriest I've ever been. But that's probably the longest I'd gone without food in my life, certainly up to that point in time, intentionally, or not intentionally. Like there have been times when I've done so intentionally. So being a kid and everything, and so it was just awful. So he sits me down and he gets the story out of me, and he buys me dinner. And I was like, oh man, that was, you know, like the best food I ever had. And so I'm reading the story that we're going to be on this morning, the feeding of the 4,000. And the interesting thing about the feeding of the 4,000 is in the text, and we'll get there in just a moment. Jesus tells his disciples, you know, nobody's had anything to eat for 3 days. Like, they hadn't eaten in 3 days. And I'm like, man, I couldn't even make it like one whole day, you know, like all the way around, you know, and it was most of the day. But could you imagine like 3 days, how absolutely hungry you would be? And And then I've known people in my life who, people who were lived in really below the poverty line. I've had friends like that, and they talk about, like being hungry. And I'm always very thankful that I don't have those kinds of physical needs. But and I want to talk about this idea of God meeting our needs and how and why God meets our needs in the way that he does. It's kind of like the text, cast your cares upon him, for he cares for you. And it's true that we, often we have physical needs, but we have other needs as well, don't we? In fact, in 1943, Abraham Maslow published his groundbreaking article, A Theory on Human Motivation, otherwise known as Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs. And, we know we have physiological needs and social needs and security needs and all that kind of stuff. And his contention is that these needs build on one another. And I'm not doing like a psychology lecture, but I do just want to state what some of those different needs are, just to kind of give an overview of various needs that people have in their lives. And he talks about how the needs build on one another. And the first needs that we typically want to try and meet are physiological needs: air, water, food, clothes, shelter. So if you don't have any air, you're not worried about, going to class that night and getting your education. You're not worried about your friendship need, or something else. You need air, and so you're going to do that. You're going to do whatever you can to get air. Once having met your physiological needs, he says we graduate to safety needs: living in a safe area, having medical insurance, job security, financial resources. Once our safety needs are met, people begin to focus on social needs like friendship and belonging and love. And once we have our social needs, our social needs are met, then we begin to focus on esteem needs like self-respect, achievement, attention, and recognition. And then once those self-respect needs are met, we look to self-actualize, where we look for meaning and purpose in life. And there's no denying that these are all needs that people have. And you can argue, well, it's not really that linear. We all have different needs, and we try to meet, a lot of these different needs at the same time. I don't know. But I do know that these are all needs that people have. And I think that just about all of us can find ourselves on the spectrum somewhere, that we can find, that yes, I have esteem needs. Yes, I have self-actualization needs, or whatever it happens to be. And whatever needs we have, they're significant to us. They're important to us. These are the things that we think about, the things that we worry about. In many ways, our needs are very defining for our lives. And I've always heard it said that God doesn't necessarily give us what we want, but he does give us what we need. And I believe that's true to the extent that our needs are met in Christ. That Maslow didn't talk about any needs where ultimately the solution or the answers are not found in God. And I believe that God does want to meet our need. I think it's part of the grand covenant that we have with God. The covenant with God all throughout the Bible is, I will be your God, you will be my people. That we love God, we serve him, we worship him, and in turn, he loves us and he cares for our needs. It's part of that, that overarching covenant that we have with God. And I think we see images of that, pictures of that covenant here in this story, in the feeding of the 4,000, and how God meets our needs, and how he is able to, and just some principles around kind of how that works. And we're going to pick up the story in verse 29 of chapter 15. Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up on a mountainside and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion on these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have had nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. His disciples answered, where could we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied, and a few small fish. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and when he had given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and they in turn to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. Afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was 4,000, beside women and children. After Jesus had sent the crowd away, he got into a boat and went to the vicinity of Madigan. So, first, I think it's important for us to understand that Jesus is able to meet our needs. That he has the power to meet our needs. That he has the authority to meet our needs. Now the situation here is these people are hungry. You know, they haven't had anything to eat for 3 days, which is interesting because they're looking to their spiritual needs before they're looking to their physiological needs, right? It's kind of turning Maslow upside down. But you got to remember, this is Jesus, right? And he's revealing himself to be God. And imagine that you're in that place. You're up on, they're on a mountainside. It says they're on a mountain, and these people have come to him, and all these people are there. And in a crowd that large, 4,000 men plus their families, there's all sorts of sickness and diseases. And you know, the lame, the mute, the blind, you know, all the stuff that they listed there. And just one after the other are coming, and Jesus is healing them. And the people had to be going out of their mind. This is so awesome. They thought that, you know, they were seeing God in the flesh, which is exactly what was going on. I mean, this was just an incredible encounter with God. And so they forgot about all that other stuff because they were so engrossed, so mesmerized by all of the excitement and everything that was going on. And think about it. You know, we can put it in context of eternity. You know, we just sang the Revelation song, which is one of my favorite worship songs. And Liddell did a beautiful job with that, by the way, wherever she is. There you are. Thank you. But it's beautiful. You know, when you find yourself in the presence of God, and you're standing before him, or probably more accurate, just falling on your face before him, are you going to be thinking about lunch? You know, are you going to be thinking about, you know, I need to go and watch the next episode of Downton Abbey? You know, you're not thinking about any of that stuff. Your focus is on the Lord. I mean, you know, the Spirit is moving. Things are happening. And you lose track of time. You lose track of all that stuff. It's just not important anymore. And so that's what's going on. And so the people haven't had anything to eat. Jesus is afraid they're going to collapse on the way home. I mean, you know how you get when you don't eat. You know, their knees are wobbly, and the people are starving. They're not starving in the figurative sense, like we always say, you know, before dinner. Oh, what's for dinner? I'm starving. No, they're starving in the real. Their bodies are being impacted physiologically. And so Jesus tells the disciples, hey, you guys need to take care of this. And immediately the disciples begin to push back. Now, I know that hindsight is 20/20, and I don't really mean to throw the disciples under the bus. But it's like, you know, do you remember who Jesus is? For 3 days, he's been, healing every disease and sickness, the mute, the blind, the lame. You would have thought after they saw a few lame people walk, a few blind people see, that they would have had a real can-do attitude. That they would have been really excited about what God was going to do next. But instead, they just start bemoaning the fact, we just don't have enough bread, we don't have enough fish, we don't really have what we need. And so, they're like, oh, we just don't know what we're going to do. So Jesus has to remind them who he is. So he tells everybody to sit down, and he starts multiplying the food and gives it to everybody. He reminds them that he is the incarnation of the living God, that his resources are endless, that he is able to meet their needs, that he is, the sovereign Lord of the universe. Now, I think a lot of us here say, well, I kind of see where you're going with this, but, I don't see God doing a lot of that kind of stuff today. I can't remember the last time I saw, 10, 12,000 people fed with 7 loaves. You know how many times I've seen that? 0. You know how many times I've seen some of the stuff that's going on in scriptures? I don't know that I've ever seen that. So, you're spiritualizing and you really can't take it there. Well, I would actually heartily disagree with that. And I would very much beg to differ. I believe that God is moving and working everywhere. And we see it all the time. We just have to have eyes to see. As we begin to look at things, how they really are, there are things happening all the time around us that don't make any sense unless God is involved. I'll give you one, for instance, of dozens and dozens that I personally know of. So in 1930, there's a guy named Nathan Stein, and he has to drop out of medical school because of hardship. He just can't afford to go to medical school, and he never did go back. And before he died, he passed on his dream of becoming a doctor to his grandson, Kevin. Now, Kevin was a smart kid. He was accepted into medical school, but he had no money, 0 money to be able to pay the tuition. Now his father, Sherman, who was Nathan's son, is a realtor. And he decided that he was going to try to increase his listings, to try and drum up more business to be able to pay for his son's tuition. So he's looking through I don't know what they have, those services, where they have the listings. And so he's looking through all the different listings, and he sees that a house has come up for sale, and it's the house that his father lived in the last 13 years of his life. And he had sold it to somebody else, and now somebody else was selling it. And he said, I don't know why. He said, just as an urge, like I just had this need to go to the house. And it's not like I'm going to get any business because, the house was already listed, but, for whatever reason, I need to go to the house. So he went to the house, and he's the only one at the house, and the doorbell rings, and it's the postman. And the postman has a registered letter for his father. And he says, well, my father's passed, but I'm his son, and so I would, I'll sign for the letter. So he signs for the letter, and inside is the final notice on a bank account that has been discontinued, and the amount in the bank account is the exact amount of money that he needs for Kevin's tuition for all his medical school, with interest. His father had opened the account 20 years ago. It had been accruing interest, and now it's exactly what Kevin needs to be able to go to medical school. And you say, wow, that's a wonderful miracle. That's not even the miracle. The miracle is that had the regular postman been on duty, he would not have been an hour late. If he were not an hour late, he would have missed Sherman altogether. The regular postman had not missed a day of work in 10 years. Hadn't taken a day sick, hadn't taken vacation, had done that route every single day except Sundays for 10 years. It just so happened that on that day, that postman, for the first time in 10 years, took his first sick day. And because of that, the guy who filled in for him had no idea what his route was like because no one had ever filled in for him. So he was an hour late who just happened to show up at the exact same time Sherman was there. The other thing is that had the regular postman been on the job and he was an hour late, he still wouldn't have knocked on the door because he would have known that Nathan no longer lived at the house, that he had indeed passed. I believe that God smiled when Sherman opened that letter. I believe that God delights in his providence. He delights in demonstrating his goodness. He delights in demonstrating his mercy and his grace to his people. He delights in blessing his people. He delights in using his power to minister to us. And God is able. And so we know that God is able, that his power is such to meet our needs. And again, I could go on all day with stories just like that, where you look at them and in all rationality, you're like, there's no way that can happen without the Lord being a part of it. Also, I think we see here is that we can trust God to meet our needs because God loves us. The text says in verse 32 that Jesus had compassion on the people. I actually believe that is an incredibly redundant statement, because Jesus has just spent 3 days healing the blind, the sick, the lepers, every disease, every sickness. So yes, Jesus has compassion on the people, and he cares for our physical needs, and he cares for our spiritual needs. And I think we see a measure of sacrifice in Jesus meeting our needs, or at least in this particular situation. Like, this cost Jesus. So Jesus says, we can't send them away because they haven't had anything to eat for 3 days. Listen, Jesus is including himself in that statement, right? He's on a roll. He's meeting the needs of all the people. They're so engrossed in what's going on that they don't want to miss anything, which means what? That Jesus has been going nonstop. Because he doesn't stop so they can go get something to eat or whatever. He's so focused on the people and their needs that he forgets about his own needs. I think sometimes we have this tendency to oversimplify God's providence and his goodness. We think, here's how God works. I'm going to pray. I'm in this situation, and I need money or whatever. And so, we think, well, God can just make money magically appear in my bank account. And I guess he could. I mean, he has the ability to do that, but that's not typically how he works. Like, honestly, often when God works in our lives, it is as a cost to himself, like in meeting our greatest need. Our greatest need is salvation. Our greatest need is forgiveness. Our greatest need is reconciliation with our Creator. Dickens' Tale of Two Cities tells the story of a Frenchman by the name of Charles Darnay, who is sentenced to be executed by the guillotine. And the situation is doubly tragic because he leaves behind a beautiful family, a young wife and daughter. Now, Darnay is friends with an underachieving English lawyer named Sidney Carton. And Carton has squandered his great potential. He's obviously a person with a great mind and all these really incredible attributes, but he just squandered it all in wild living. And almost pretty much no one respects him. He doesn't think a lot of himself. Other people do not think a lot of him. And when his friend is sentenced to be executed, it sobers him up, like figuratively and literally. It just really shakes him out of how he has been living and how he views life and all of these things. And so one night he goes to the home of his friend who's wasting away in a dungeon waiting to be executed. So he goes to Darnay's house and he's standing in the courtyard and he looks up and he sees the light on in his daughter's window. And it's then that Carton decides to do the noblest thing that he's ever done before. And so on the night before Darnay was to be executed, Carton, his friend, goes to visit him in the dungeon where they were keeping him. And he convinces his friend to exchange clothing. And so the next day, Sidney Carton is executed as Charles Darnay. And as they lead him up to the guillotine with his hands bound, he looks up to survey the world one last time, and these are the words that come to his mind. No one has greater love than this, than he laid down his life for his friends. That's what Jesus did for us. That's how much he cares. That's how much he loves us. And if he loves us enough to die for our spiritual needs, do you think he's not also at some level, at least not interested in our physical needs and the cares that we have? I mean, again, he cares for us. And again, you know, it's not always as simple as we think, because, you know, sometimes what he knows is best are not necessarily the things that we think are best. And sometimes we actually work against God's moving in our lives, and we sabotage God's best in our lives. And sometimes we actually have competing needs, like what's best for us financially is not always best for us spiritually. And you say, oh, well, that's just nothing but a big cop-out to explain why things don't always go our way, and why bad things still happen to us, and why when we pray we don't always get exactly what we want. No, that's really not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the world is a complicated place, and we don't always see clearly because we don't have the lenses of eternity. We don't have God's perspective on things. But I do know this, that those who trust in the Lord and those who trust in his love tend to be far more fulfilled and happier individuals. And so we can trust God to meet our needs. Again, going back to the covenant, you know, I will be your God, you will be my people. And as his people, we can look to him as our God, and he cares for us because he is able, because he loves us, and finally, because he is faithful. It's so important for us to remember the things that God has done for us and the ways that he has worked in our lives in the past. Again, I hate to pick on the disciples, but they come off as really terrible in this situation. They come off as completely ignorant and lacking in faith, and honestly, at this point, even lacking in common sense. Because this isn't the first time that they've been asked to feed a crowd of people with a few loaves and a few fish. Like just the last chapter, Matthew chapter 14, we find the feeding of the 5,000. And it's pretty much the exact same request. Like Jesus is giving them an opportunity to retake the test. And once again, they fail. And again, this was days earlier, weeks earlier at the most, and they just don't get it. Furthermore, they've been sitting there with Jesus for 3 days as nonstop as he has been performing miracle after miracle after miracle. And so once again, Jesus does the same thing he did when he fed the 5,000. He said, okay, have everybody sit on the grass like you know the drill. And he starts, handing out the loaves and handing out the fishes from his endless basket, however he made that work. And I guarantee you that when the disciples were handing out the loaves and handing out the fish, not a single one of them wasn't thinking about the feeding of the 5,000. And they were going, oh, yeah, I remember that. Oh, I should have known. Why did I get so worked up? Why did I allow us, why did I react in that way? I should have known that Jesus was going to come through. And it's more than this, but it reminds me of, that legendary sports hero who always comes through. For me, that was always Joe Montana. I grew up in San Francisco, and in Super Bowl 23, the 49ers were playing the Cincinnati Bengals. And there was 1:18 left in the game, and the 49ers got the ball back, and they were behind by less than a touchdown, but more than a field goal. They had to go the length of the field to win the Super Bowl. And Joe Montana then leads the team on what has become one of the greatest drives in NFL history, culminating with a touchdown pass to John Taylor to win the game. And John Madden, the famous announcer, says this was the greatest drive in NFL history. And I saw a special, and he's talking about the drive. And he says, the interesting thing about that drive, he says that every single person on the 49ers, everybody on the bench, every coach, every trainer, everybody knew that Joe was going to do it. Everybody. He said, not only that, he said, but everybody in the stands, every single person in the stands knew that he was going to take them the length of the field. And I mean, they were backed up on their own goal line. That's really hard to do. He said, not only that, he said, everybody watching on TV, he said, everybody knew that he was going to do it. Oh, and everybody on the Bengals knew it too. That no matter what they did, no matter how hard they tried, that he was going to lead them to score the touchdown. And, I don't know why we struggle so in life with so many of the things that we need. It's like we forget all of the times that God has come through for us in the past. Because like with Joe, it's like they knew he was going to do it because he had done it so many times before. Well, we should know that God is going to come through. He's going to meet our needs because of all of the times that he has met our needs before. And for most of us, God has worked in our lives in a variety of ways, in a variety of situations. And I don't know why, we forget. Like when stuff happens and all of a sudden, there's a need that we have and we have all this stress, all this anxiety. We just forget. It's like God can work 100 times in our lives, and on the 101st, the sky is falling. And it's the worst thing ever, and we just don't know how we're going to make it through. I think one of the most dangerous things that can happen to us spiritually is to develop spiritual amnesia. One of the most destructive things to our faith is to forget how God has worked in our lives in the past. It's one of the reasons why the patriarchs used to set up altars in the desert. If you read the book of Genesis, you see they're always, Joseph and Jacob and Abraham, they're always, building these altars in the desert. What are they doing with these altars? Because they're not really places of worship. They're not necessarily making sacrifices there. I mean, it's not that kind of altar. So what's the purpose of this? Well, they basically make a big stack of rocks out in the desert. So every time they pass by that place, they can look at it and go, oh yeah, that's where God did this really awesome thing. I remember that vividly now. And so they were there to remind them of how awesome God is and how he has been faithful in their lives. I don't know what needs you have. Where you are on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if you're like me, well, I got some needs on this level and I got some needs, it's not linear. It's just, but they're on there, right? That's a good survey of different needs that people have. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I got that, and here's what we do. We look at those needs, and we have those needs. We feel them very deeply. And then we start trying to look to fulfill those needs in other places besides the Lord. And we begin to trust in other things and seek other things to be able to meet our needs in life. And in doing so, we're kind of going outside the covenant. And we're denying that covenant that God has with us. Again, I will be your people, I will be your God, you will be my people. That's the mantra. That's pretty much the theme of the Bible from the very beginning to the very end. And so the way this works is as human beings, we're created for fellowship, intimate relationship with the living God. And we worship him, we serve him, we love him, and he loves us. And he cares for us, and he meets our needs. And that's where faith comes in, and trust. And why do we do that? Well, we see some of the reasons why right here in the feeding of the 4,000. Because he is able, because he is loving, and because he is faithful. And if we can own that and know that, we face life differently. We face our needs differently. We face our problems differently. And we look to the Lord and we trust him to meet our needs. Let's pray. Father,